Marcus is doing something not just that's beautiful, but, sometimes beautiful things have a practical value. The beauty of the meditations makes it more evocative and more memorable, and therefore more therapeutic.
Well, I think you've done it, because my view up until now is that there was not a great biography of Marcus Aurelius.
I was always a bit disappointed they didn't talk more about his philosophy in most of the other biographies.
But, Anthony Everett, who we were talking about earlier, he has a great biography of Nero. He has Hadrian. He has Augustus. There's great biographies of Julius Caesar, and there's a million about Cleopatra. There's not been... It's a weird omission that such a fascinating figure does not have a definitive biography.
There's a lot of biographies, but they're all not entirely... I always felt there was something lacking.
Yeah.
Frank McLinn's is the most famous one.
But that's 50 years old?
Yeah, and it's an odd book because it's got really long digressions in it. It's much longer than it needs to be, but also he's really negative about Stoicism. Yeah. And you can see people get kind of disappointed by that when they read it, because they're mainly reading it because they're into Stoicism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's two great biographies of Seneca, the James Romm and the Emily Wilson.
Yeah.
But there really isn't, not only, there's not even great sort of historical ones, but there's a number of really good essays on Marcus Aurelius, just incredible essays. There's the Matthew Arnold one. Is it Brand Blanchard has a great one. There's that Ernest Renan has one. There's great, they'll capture him in 5,000 to 10,000 words, an extended essay.
Yeah.
But a full book-length treatment of one of the most fascinating figures who ever lived seems a strange, omission of history.
Yeah, I got invited to write it as well, so it wasn't really something that I was kind of planning to do.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't entirely sure how it would turn out when I started it. But yeah, I was interested in the psychological angle on it, and what the things that appealed to me about him.
What are they?
Well, I was interested in how his philosophy helped him to cope with the problems he was facing, basically. In a way, it's really simple, right? Same reason that most people today are interested in him. That was what I tried. I wanted to know, I didn't want to know all the kind of minutiae about what it was like being a Roman emperor and stuff like that. I wanted to know, why did this guy write the Meditations? How did it help him? What were the problems that he faced? Basically, people are interested in Marcus Aurelius because they're looking for a role model, right?
Yes.
Essentially. And then I think they're disappointed maybe in some of the historical accounts of him because they don't get a role model from it.
Yeah. Is it, I've been raving about this biography. Anne wrote a biography of Pontius Pilate.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll give it to you in the bookstore.
Yeah, I'll check out.
And you wouldn't think that would be a person who you could write a great biography because he's a villain, but two, because there's just not that much information about him. And I always wondered if that was the trick about Marcus Aurelius too, which is we know a lot about what Marcus Aurelius thought. But the historical record about him is relatively thin, if only because he wasn't a villain.
Yeah.
If he had been much worse, I wonder if we would know more about him.
Definitely. So in the surviving Roman histories, particularly in the Historia Augusta, one of the challenges is that because Marcus is a good emperor and because he's very rational and he's very temperate, he's in a sense the least exciting character in his own story. And the other characters that surround him, particularly Hadrian and Lucius Verus, and to some extent Avidius Cassius, are much more colourful and larger than life, because they do crazy, violent, it's self-indulgent things.
Yeah.
And so everyone remembers that. And Marcus is at the kind of centre of this, acting normally and being very reasonable.
Well, I'm just thinking about this right now because he talks about it in Meditations. There's this repeated effort by Marcus to convince himself that he doesn't need to do great deeds, that he doesn't need to conquer foreign lands, that he doesn't need to worry about becoming famous, that his posthumous legacy is worthless. And so he's just kind of present and trying to do a good and balanced, and as you said, temperate job in a very difficult circumstances. But history is written not just by the victors, but by the hungriest and the most legacy-obsessed individuals. So if Marcus had seen his life as needing to be this monument to his achievements, that if he was Julius Caesar weeping at the foot of an Alexander the Great statue, lamenting the paucity of his accomplishments, that would have propelled him to go and do things, not just wage wars, but build temples. He wasn't trying to build this impressive resume that would resound through history. And then we look, the result is that we don't know as much about him as we do about the desperate, bad, egomaniacal figures of history.
Yeah, and that helps. It helps that they're around him when I'm writing the biography, because then I can put him in a setting and describe like how he would be thinking about their behavior.
Yeah,
because he tells us in the Meditations. So even if he's not doing these crazy, colorful things, like the way I approached writing the biography was to look at his relationship with these more colourful characters in a little bit more detail, and to do a little bit more research into Hadrian and Lucius Verus and Avidius Cassius, so that I could talk a little bit more about Marcus's social environment, if you like, and like what I imagine he would be saying to himself based on the Meditations. For example, you mentioned Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, and that's a really good example because Marcus mentions them in the Meditations, but only to say he doesn't particularly admire them or look at them as role models. Like, he looks to philosophers more because of their spiritual or psychological achievements, like their moral achievements.
Well, you could argue this that Antoninus, who Marcus Aurelius thinks is like the greatest emperor ever, there's basically nothing on Antoninus. I read one biography that was written in like the 1800s, I think, and it's pretty dense. Both of them are boring, effectively. And because they're boring, what's actually great about them gets sort of thrown out with the bathwater. We just don't, because they weren't waging these wars of conquest, or they weren't, memorializing their greatness, or ghostwriting these memoirs, design like Julius Caesar. We know about Julius Caesar because he not only, invades Gaul, but then he writes this book about it. Cicero wasn't just content to be a great orator. He needed to write the first draft of history about what a great orator he was. And so there's this kind of publication bias of history that favors the loudest, most aggrandizing individuals, and then we snub the sort of quiet greatness. Yeah,
that's definitely the case. I mean, and Marcus is unusual. I mean, maybe we'd be much more interested in Antoninus Pius if he'd written a book like the Meditations. So you're right. It's like, it reminds me of that expression, no news is good news.
Yes.
Right. So Antoninus's reign was fantastic, the Senate thought, because nothing much happened.
Yeah.
There weren't any major wars, like everything was really stable. And Marcus might have been remembered in the same way, as a kind of two-dimensional character, if it wasn't for the fact that by chance we've got this amazing window onto the soul of one of the most powerful men in history, which is, it's almost mesmerizing to think about the fact that we get to peek inside his mind, basically, and see what he's thinking.
Yeah, we have the innermost thoughts of, like, typically someone who is quiet and eschews the spotlight and wants to focus on just being a good person and defers credit and all of these things. Typically they're never even going to make it to a position that is so prominent that by definition you become famous. Like that and certainly today, where these offices, you have to seek that office out and fight for it and claw your way to the top. So Marcus is really this fluke of history in that very rarely would the most powerful, important, and famous person in the world get there by accident. And because Marcus gets there by accident, we do have sort of a lone example of like what a good person in that job would feel like and do and be motivated by and think about. But there's not really that many other circumstances. I've been writing about Harry Truman a lot. Harry Truman's like a regular guy that ends up president of the United States of America kind of by these set of circumstances. And by the way, I've been looking for it. One of his biographers, Merle Miller, is talking to Truman about his love of ancient history, and Truman goes back to his room and he brings back his copy of Meditations, which is covered in all these underlines and about the four virtues and all this stuff. And I've been trying lately to go like, well, where is this? I asked the Truman Library if it's there. I want to know where this book is.
That's awesome.
Because it would be cool to see. But there's not many examples like that, because typically the people that end up as Caesar or general or insert prominent position, they didn't get there by accident. It was important. Marcus Aurelius talks about the dangers of ambition, and by definition, to get those things, you have to be very, very ambitious.
Well, actually, you made me think of something that I would... Sometimes when you're writing a biography, you try and say things that are probably true historically.
Yeah.
But then there's things that it's tempting to speculate about, right? And you think, I have no idea whether this is true or not, but I just kind of have a hunch. So I have a hunch that Antoninus Pius was selected by Hadrian as emperor because the Senate told him, we want this guy as your successor, and you've already made such a shambles of your previous. So he appointed Lucius Verus's father, first of all, and then that guy died prematurely. And everybody seemed to have been panicking at that time about the succession. And then he picks this complete opposite character, like somebody who's the ideal emperor. The Senate seemed to largely like adore him and see him as one of their own, like the perfect guy, safe pair of hands, perfect guy for the job. And unlikely picking away for someone like Hadrian. I think he'd made a mess of things and the Senate had persuaded him this is the guy that we want in power. So the reason that we get this relatively unambitious, ordinary guy is because something's gone wrong with the succession. And people have stepped in and said, no, we need to kind of ground this again and put somebody in position who's trustworthy and, not just one of Hadrian's kind of crazy picks.
Not a clone of Hadrian, but the opposite of Hadrian. Yeah, and I think somewhat akin to where we are politically now, it's like he's supposed to do the equivalent of a single term. He's supposed to last only so long, and then he surprises everyone by being emperor for the next 20 years. So it's a second fluke in that Marcus gets a really long runway to train on the job instead of being thrown into it.
Yeah, and that's unusual. So he's definitely, I suppose in a sense you could say that Marcus Aurelius becomes, on the one hand, he seems unwilling to assume office. He sounds like he wanted to be more of a scholar, but he then becomes essentially a career politician. Unwillingly. And not only that, I guess another thing when you're writing a biography is you notice little details that people tend to get slightly confused about or slightly wrong. So we think about Marcus as becoming emperor when he assumes the title Augustus and he accedes to the throne. But the position of Roman emperor is composed of multiple titles and powers. So it's not really exactly what we would think of today as an emperor. And many of those powers, some of those powers can be shared and they can be assumed at different times. Marcus gets most of those powers and titles 13 years earlier while he's still serving as Caesar alongside. He's almost like a co-emperor or a deputy emperor to Antoninus Pius for 13 years before he actually becomes fully fledged emperor himself. And as soon as he does it, he appoints his own co-emperor.
Well, I noticed that in the book. That's an interesting point that you made because, it feels totally unprecedented that Marcus would name Lucius Verus, who's not really his stepbrother or brother. It's a very tenuous
Yeah.
relationship that they have. They very easily could have been seen as rivals. There's a Stoic teacher who advises Octavian.
Yeah.
There cannot be too many Caesars,
Yeah.
and he kills what is actually his blood relation.
Yep.
So it feels very unprecedented that Marcus the first thing that Marcus Aurelius does with absolute power is
Yeah.
he gives half of it away.
Yeah.
But you're right. Actually, no. The precedent is he watched Antoninus do that with him for 2 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also wants to make sure that when he eventually dies, this younger man has had plenty of experience to step into the position.
Because Lucius is younger than him.
Yeah. And actually, in some ways, Lucius Verus, I think, was perceived as... So the family trees of Roman aristocrats are like spaghetti junction, right? They're confusing. So Lucius Verus, in some ways, is kind of like Marcus's son. Like, he's his adoptive brother, but he's 10 years younger than him, but he marries Marcus's daughter.
Right.
And Marcus also, when they become emperor, gives him the name Verus, which is Marcus's family name, which is something you would do when you adopt somebody as a son. So he's kind of ambiguous. He's his brother, but he also looks somewhat like a son to him.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of feeds into the perception of him as being a kind of a deputy co-emperor. It was clear that Marcus is the senior emperor, and Marcus's name always comes first on inscriptions. Like, it was clear, although on paper they're both co-emperors, that Marcus is the senior one and Lucius is his junior. But what it would remind Romans of, this idea of having the co-emperor, is that they have 2 consuls in the Senate.
When it was a republic,
there
was 2 heads of state.
Yeah, and so the idea is that they could veto each other to prevent autocracy.
Yeah.
I'm not clear to what extent the co-emperors would have power to limit each other's power, but certainly I think the perception is that it's there to prevent.
It's probably just better for the soul that there's not 1 but 2. It's not good for anyone to be the most powerful person in the world. That Cold War scholar saying there has to be a countervailing power. It's not good to have a unipolar world. You need 2 superpowers that, or ideally more, that sort of check each other or balance each other. It's not good to have the full weight of anything on someone's shoulders. I'm not even just talking about for good governance. I'm just saying, like, it's probably bad for you. Yeah. It's better to be part of a team or a duo.
Yeah. And Marcus seems clear about that in the Meditations. It's a concern that he has about himself. But you can also, if you're doing a deep dive into interpreting someone's words, you could think, so these things that he says about himself being Caesarified, that must also apply to Lucius Verus.
Sure.
And to
or
Commodus.
Antoninus.
Yeah, and to Antoninus, right? The other people around him, he must have similar concerns about. But Lucius Verus seems like an unlikely pick, because he wasn't particularly good in the role as far as we know. Marcus seems to have wanted him to deal with the military, and to think that the perception was that he was younger and he was into sports and stuff. He maybe had some kind of vague military connection. And so he thought, you can be my representative with the military, but he doesn't seem particularly interested in doing that.
That is we'll bounce all over, but I do, if Marcus has a flaw, it's weirdly, it's his passivity and acceptance of flawed people in roles that they are obviously unqualified for. Like, there's something to be said about trying to get the best out of people, not expecting perfection of people, playing the hand you're dealt. But there is this kind of remarkable resignation to, let's hope it works out with this person. And there is fundamentally something kind of irresponsible about that, to willingly let someone who's unqualified or flawed or whatever handle something upon which lives of many, many people depend.
That's definitely one of the most puzzling things about him. And I'm tempted to. I feel like there's more to it than we can be aware of somehow. It seems like there's got to be more going on there. Definitely, I think his biggest mistake was appointing Avidius Cassius as the governor of Syria, because that looks like it would, and did, and lead to a civil war.
Yeah.
Basically, or the beginning of a civil war. And it was obvious, in retrospect, that was a risk when he did that. The Romans had a policy against appointing somebody as a governor in their own place of birth. They didn't normally do that. In fact, even when they recruited foreign troops as auxiliary units, they would usually send them to the other side of the empire so that they wouldn't just rebel.
So there's no conflicting loyalties?
Yeah, so there's no conflict of interest. And so he appoints Avidius Cassius as governor of Syria, which is where he was born. And he's clearly a guy he's very blue-blooded. He's a descendant of Herod the Great. He's a distant descendant of Augustus. He's got all of, he would definitely have been perceived as a potential monarch.
Yeah.
And in the East, that was particularly dangerous. It was easy for someone to kind of get into a position of being a ruler like a king, if they were in command of an army. And so it seems obvious that this guy is going to be threatening to break away, and that's exactly what happens. So it's puzzling why Marcus... I think my only guess is that he felt he didn't have any choice somehow. The initial mistake was sending him there at all to be a general in command. The best that I can make out is that his reasoning there was that he was a strict disciplinarian, and he had the biggest reputation for that in the army, and the Syrian legions were so dissolute, allegedly, if we can believe the Historia Augusta. It kind of, maybe exaggerates that a bit, but it says these troops were in terrible shape, they were undisciplined, so he sends the most notorious disciplinarian in the army to go and try and sort them out. But as soon as he makes that decision, it's a slippery slope, and he's bound to seize power, and that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, it's a pattern in Marcus's life, right? That there are these things that he didn't have a choice about, and those end up being catastrophic failures a couple of times. Lucius Verus being one, Avidius Cassius being one, Commodus being the final and most egregious of them. And if it happens enough times, I feel like it stops being it stops being something life is doing to you and something you are doing. And so I wonder, I make up that, this idea of tolerant with others, strict with yourself, that you got to make it work, that when you're in the ring with someone and they gouge you, you don't take it personally. You just there was fundamentally in him, I think, an inability to make hard personnel decisions. Mm-hmm. And there's a kindness in that. It's hard when you don't want to be the person that fires someone. You don't want to be the judge, jury, and executioner in some cases. I think Marcus struggles. I mean, you could even argue the persecutions with the Christians, which you talk about as being somewhat overstated. But there was, and maybe he's even using the Stoicism as an excuse, an inability to go, hey, I'm the most powerful man in the world. If I'm not going to draw the line here, if anyone has power over this situation, it's me. And he seemed somewhat reluctant to do that. And a lot of his big, if it could have gone otherwise, moments in his life come down to kind of some version of that.
Now, I think the difference that springs to mind from a modern CEO would be that Marcus wouldn't just be sacking somebody or replacing them in a role. He'd probably, actually, for most of these people we're talking about, he'd probably have to exile them or more likely have them killed.
Yes. You can't just politely tell your son he doesn't get to be the emperor.
Yeah, you just hang out and wait in the wings. So people would have rallied around him probably and tried to use him, exploit him as a potential ruler, maybe to fragment the empire.
But in Avidius Cassius's case, that's what happened anyway.
That happened. And then that, that strangely that ends. There's another thing I'd speculate about, actually. I've maybe just touched on it a little bit in the book. There's one case, I think it's the Historia Augusta, that says Marcus was not as straightforward as people assume, and it kind of implies that he was more cunning, and he put on this kind of veneer of simplicity and straightforwardness in his dealings with other people. And I kind of wondered what that was alluding to. And I think it's possible that the story that we get is that Avidius Cassius was just bumped off by two of his senior officers, and then they put his head in a bag and just kind of leisurely stroll out of Syria with this guy's emperor's head in a sack to present it to Marcus. Nobody stops them, which seems kind of completely implausible. Like, actually, I think that it sounds...
It sets up the theatrics of Marcus. I can't see. This is horrible. Don't have it.
It really seems like propaganda, and I can't be sure, but it certainly looks more like a coordinated coup that was organized to overthrow Avidius Cassius. Whether other people just did that because they knew that Marcus would look favorably on them and pardon them and so on, or whether Marcus was involved in planning it, perhaps. I don't know, but certainly Marcus was criticized for being too lenient to Avidius Cassius's family, particularly his daughter and son-in-law. And so it's tempting. It's a guy called Druncianus. And it's tempting. How would those guys get out of Syria with his head in a bag unless a general or whoever was now in power allowed them to do it? And it may have been his son-in-law, and that might be why Marcus allowed him to retain most of his fortune and didn't prosecute him and so on.
I think what you're pointing to is that you can't be the emperor and be a kindly old man. There is fundamentally some Machiavellian aspect to it. I think of this all the time. Like, Warren Buffett presents himself as this nice, frugal, philosopher. But you don't become the richest man in the world without, also being a shark. And I suspect that as much as Antoninus teaches Marcus about being good, and as much as Marcus strives not to be Caesarified and dyed purple, ultimately, he's sitting there with a choice going, do I let a civil war go on, let hundreds of thousands of people die, let the empire be torn in half, or do I order a coordinated assassination on a person who is trying to overthrow my reign and murder my family? Yeah. At some point, he probably gets, he says, what if there's brambles in the path go around? You're not living in Plato's Republic. He probably does have to make the hard decisions that heads of state have to make.
And I think you touch on one of the other motives that people are often unaware of in my experience, which is, but that most historians, most classicists seem to be aware of when they're talking about Marcus, which is the big fear of the Senate in particular is civil war.
Yeah.
Like, more than any frontier war, because you just send the legions to go and fight in Parthia
it's
or
so
Germania,
far away,
right? But if there's a civil war, Julius Caesar, when he had his civil war, occupied Rome and it was evacuated. It got right to the heart of the empire, and so the Senate are terrified of the empire fragmenting, and the Romans have experienced many civil wars in the past, and they don't want that to happen again. And one of the main things that could cause that is if there are multiple rivals to the throne. So there's a lot of pressure from the Senate to bump off, get rid of potential contenders for the throne. And so, the real puzzle, for example, with Commodus is, in a sense, why did Marcus choose to have so many children? Because he's then stuck having to choose one of them to be his successor. And he doesn't know if he's going to be any good or not, unless he was just very pious and thought, I trust the gods to give me a son that's going to be a good successor.
You raised another good point. That's kind of another thing where he's like, I hope it works out, and that's when you're the leader, you can't just hope it works out, because other people bear the consequences of your leniency or your hopefulness or your whatever. And when you look at Marcus as a leader, there does seem to be a bit of, he certainly grows into the role, certainly learns that he has to make hard decisions, and does, I think, a remarkable job, especially when you what's that Biden line about? Don't compare me to the Almighty. Compare me to my predecessor.
Yeah.
You know, when you compare him to the people who came before and after him, he's an incredible emperor. But when you look at just his reign, it does feel like there are moments where firmness or harshness or more pragmatic decisions were required. That I do think, in the Stoic history there are similar examples. I talk a lot about that moment in Cato's life where Cato is approached by Pompey to make a marriage alliance, and he says, "I will not be bought." And what happens is Pompey aligns with Caesar instead, and brings about the destruction of the Republic that Cato then dramatically and selflessly gives his life in martyrdom to. Like, Cato might not have had to kill himself if he'd just been able to stomach a marriage alliance.
Compromise more. Yeah. Now, I think to evaluate what happens with Marcus and Commodus, so we mentioned earlier that he's got this problem. People say, couldn't he just adopt a son? But then what's Commodus going to do?
Yeah,
right.
Something has to happen in a dark room.
Yeah, he's going to die.
Yeah,
it's a death sentence, basically, right? And the other thing I think we need to consider is who would be the alternative. Like, so the other, we know, because like he seized power. Avidius Cassius would be one of the main rivals. So what would the Roman Empire have been like if Marcus had adopted Avidius Cassius, say, and appointed him as his successor? Like, our sources perhaps aren't very reliable regarding his life, but they paint a picture of someone who's much more of a military hawk, much more aggressive, executing large numbers of enemy tribesmen, maybe committing genocide, So it would have been a more violent reign, probably. That's the
no given, right? No guarantee. So you're essentially stuck with the impossible choice of, do I bet on a stranger, or do I hope that my son, like, do I bet on my own flesh and blood and hope that I can make this a success? I mean, that's an impossible choice for a parent to make.
Now, he did do something else. Like, we're told there's a guy called Pompeianus, who is Marcus's most senior general. And not only that, but Marcus has him marry his daughter Lucilla, who is kind of Augusta twice over, because she is the widow of Lucius Verus. So she was previously married to an emperor,
co-emperor,
and she's the daughter of an emperor. So Pompeianus is kind of overlooked sometimes, but first of all, he's his most senior military commander, and secondly, he's like a hair's breadth away from being emperor in the sense that he's married to Lucilla.
Sure.
And he's with Marcus. He accompanies him all of the time, on his military campaigns. We see him in sculpture depicted by Marcus's side, and we're told that Marcus invited him to become Caesar. We're also told that Marcus appointed him as a mentor to Commodus, almost like a sort of godfather or something like that, or to supervise him and kind of keep him in line. But he refused. He declined. Now, we don't know why. So there's some report about him having failing eyesight later, so he may have had health problems. There's some comments about him being unpopular because he was too foreign.
Yeah.
He was Syrian as well. And I think that there would also be a rivalry with Avidius Cassius. These are the two most senior generals. They both happen to be Syrian. One of them is equestrian, so he's from a lower class. He's been promoted. Like a number of people, Marcus operated a more meritocratic regime, partly because of the plague and the war. He lost a lot of nobles that were in senior positions, and he replaced them with people from slightly lower down the ladder. But that caused some friction with nobles like Avidius Cassius, who must have thought, hang on a minute, you've essentially promoted this guy above me.
Yeah.
And I'm related to Augustus, I'm a descendant of Eastern monarchy. Like, this guy's nobody.
Yeah.
And he's married your daughter. It's obvious that you're positioning him, to become some sort of potential successor. And so I think that's another thing that would have driven out of a kind of indignation Avidius Cassius would have been driven to revolt. So it's puzzling. Maybe Pompeianus thought it's going to cause civil war. I'm not going to be accepted as the ruler of Rome because I'm not.
Or maybe like Marcus, he knew it was a terrible job.
Yeah.
You know, I think I'm thinking about all these horrible decisions that you're talking about and these horrible moments that are, and when I read the story, maybe it's true or not, where that Marcus, when he's told he's going to be king, he breaks down in tears because he thinks of all the bad kings. I think he's thinking of this, you know, as a student of history, he knew that it's a job nobody makes it out alive of. Right. It's a job that works on your soul, that makes you that's very far from the black and whiteness of virtue. And you're going to have to make impossible moral decisions. And, you know, maybe that's why he wasn't attracted to it. Probably would have made him a great emperor as Marcus did. But I suspect there's some truism in history that the worst people to have in power are the people who desperately who want to be in power, and the best people are the people you really have to draft into it, because the wanting it and the needing it and the thinking you deserve it is the most dangerous thing.
Yeah, the kind of egotism and narcissism maybe that drives a lot of people to pursue power. There's another bit of trivia that might interest you about that, which is Marcus is usually depicted with two generals by his side. And the other one is Pertinax, who is a close friend of Pompeianus. And Pertinax succeeds Commodus as emperor.
Oh.
And he came from like much lower class. You know, he's another example of Marcus's meritocracy because his father was actually a slave. So he's the son of a freedman in Roman society. So we have this extraordinary situation. Like, I mean, you could even compare it to the American presidency in a sense of like how much social mobility is there when the Roman Empire, maybe in a sense, does more. Like, because this guy, whose father was a slave, ends up becoming emperor, but he only lasts a few months because the Praetorians turn on him and assassinate him. Maybe because they've been corrupted like by Commodus. But again, this guy Pompeianus doesn't become emperor, but his sidekick ends up done out of kind of desperation in a way because they need to replace Commodus with somebody. What you're saying though about, you know, where we could look, so this question about whether power corrupts and how Marcus might have perceived that. Marcus is basing a lot of his decisions on reading Epictetus.
Yes.
Right? So let's pick up Epictetus, flick through it. What might Epictetus say about this? Epictetus clearly thinks that power corrupts. He says you can't ride two horses at the same time at one point. Like, you can't serve two masters.
Yeah.
You have to decide, you know, whether you want to pursue a life of virtue or is your number one goal to be in politics. And he kind of, the way he phrases it, he says, like, basically, you're not going to be a very good politician, like, if your number one goal, like, because you're going to have to compromise sometimes, and you're going to find yourself in situations where you're going to be doing things that aren't in accord with virtue. You're probably not going to last that long in the kind of cutthroat world of politics, because there are other people competing with you who are willing to do anything to succeed. So he said, you know, if you want to be a philosopher, you need to be all in and make it your number one priority. Marcus is immersed in this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, buying into it, reading it, whether we agree with it or not. Like, that's what's got in his head. And then he finds himself in the position of emperor, like, which Epictetus views as a poison chalice.
Yeah. Maybe it's the American or the English understanding of slavery that I think skews our perception of Epictetus when we say he was a slave, right? Because we think they're working in a field somewhere, right? They're some laborer.
Right.
Epictetus is a slave working for one of Nero's highest ranking sort of ministers, secretaries, executives, right? And Epictetus would have been, you know, Epictetus wasn't out back, right? No. Epictetus was in the court of Nero. He would have seen probably even Seneca at work. He sees what is happening in the emperor's palace. Yeah. And then later when he leaves, I mean, he basically teaches a generation of the sons of wealthy Romans. So he would have met their parents.
Yeah.
And then most famously, I mean, Hadrian drops in on one of his classes, or he gets to meet Hadrian. So Epictetus was not just an astute thinker about the human condition, but has a ringside seat to power and what it does to people, and how ambition degrades and corrupts, and so that's really reflected in his writing in a way that would have resonated to Marcus.
Well, I'm going to speculate about something else that you've said, which is, what did Epictetus do as a slave? And you're right. You know, the lives of many slaves in the Roman Empire were possibly worse than the lives of slaves working in plantations. If you worked in a mine, or something like, you know, your life expectancy was negligible, and your quality of life was atrocious. But because the difference from the transatlantic slave trade was that in Greek and Roman society, people were capturing slaves from other competing civilizations.
Yes.
So you might capture someone who's a school teacher or an engineer, right? And often teachers for that reason. And people that found high positions in government were former slaves, because they spoke the language and were educated in the technology that was available and so on. So that, you know, and slaves had vastly different values in Greek and Roman society depending on their resume, essentially. And Epictetus would be an expensive slave. And I think he mentions having written letters to Roman officials, if I remember rightly, in Greek. So, and his owner was Nero's Greek secretary.
Yeah.
So I suspect that Epictetus was some sort of scribe or something like that.
Yeah.
In the household of the emperor, possibly, or in working for his Greek secretary.
Yeah, I mean, Epictetus's master is the one who kills Nero, who's so close to Nero when Nero wants to commit suicide. It's he who delivers the mortal blow.
Well, I'll give you another bit of trivia about him. Epaphroditus is his name.
I'm not that. I know the name.
It's a mouthful. Yeah.
Don't even bother.
Right, but he's also implicated in Seneca's death because he's the guy that initially notifies Nero that there's a Piso conspiracy against him that leads to this political purge that culminates in Seneca being executed. So Epictetus, it's possibly he knew Seneca. He's very close to all this stuff going on. His owner was the guy who instigated the purge that led to Seneca's execution. So Epictetus would definitely have had a lot of opinions about Seneca. Another thing people always ask about is how come they never mention Seneca's name. No Stoic mentions Seneca's name. But it's not just Marcus and Epictetus.
No Stoics post Seneca mention his name.
Yeah. No one mentions his name, and so that puzzles people. It may be because there's this odd convention that classicists often mention that authors writing in Greek in the Roman world don't tend to cite or mention authors that write in Latin, although I believe Marcus does once or twice. Marcus had definitely read Seneca, because Fronto, we have this correspondence between Marcus and Fronto's Marcus's Latin rhetoric tutor. And Fronto mentions Seneca several times in a really sniffy way. He's incredible. And at one point, he's really insulting about Seneca. He says something that only a rhetorician could say. It's what the kids today would call a sick burn, right? He says something Marcus would never have said. So we only see...
What's the burn?
We don't see what Marcus says. We only see Fronto's comment, which is, he says, looking for valuable sayings in the writings of Seneca would be like grubbing around in the bottom of a sewer, looking for a handful of silver coins in the filth. Right, so very vivid. You're like, wow. Well, how long did you spend?
You see why he's a rhetoric teacher?
That's a memorable insult, right? And I get what you're saying. We as readers of Seneca might think, no way. Seneca's writings are amazing. The letters to Lucilius, but I suspect that they're reading something else. Now, they may be reading speeches by Seneca, and we have things like, other odd writing. We have Seneca's plays, which seem very different from
his
his
natural
letters.
history is not great.
Yeah. But he also writes that thing called the pumpkinification
Yes.
of Claudius, which is a weird satire, which also seems very unstoic.
Yeah.
Like, and kind of doesn't reflect well on Seneca, because he started off sucking up to Claudius, and then after he dies, he ridicules him. But we also have On Clemency, which is this speech or letter that he writes praising Nero, portraying him as a philosopher king, saying his hands are untainted by blood, but also trying to encourage him towards clemency. And I suspect that he's reading stuff like that. So they go, well, there's good bits in this, but then the gist of the whole thing is heaping praise on Nero, and saying he's got this potential to be a philosopher king, and saying that he's guiltless of any, after he's clearly just had his little brother assassinated, and just not long after that has his mother clubbed to death. So I think these guys, Marcus mentions Nero in passing. Epictetus clearly can't stand Nero. Like, he describes him as a kind of wild animal. I suspect Marcus had mixed feelings about Seneca, because it sounds like Fronto thinks Marcus likes Seneca and he's arguing with him about it because he doesn't like him. But I think Epictetus would have said, look, Seneca compromised too much.
Yeah.
He's a guy, because Epictetus draws a kind of hard line. He's like, never flatter tyrants.
Yeah.
Never compromise, on anything, on your principles, on anything. And, if you asked him, what do you think of Seneca? I think we can get, especially if he read On Clemency, that's a good thought experiment. What would Epictetus have thought of On Clemency? He would have ripped it up.
Yeah.
Like, he would have thought, this guy's, like, playing with the devil. Like, he's kind of getting into bed with a sociopath. Like, and this is the opposite of what Stoicism should be teaching. So there's also someone that Seneca never mentions. He never mentions Musonius Rufus.
Yeah.
Although he's a bit younger than him. But he was the most famous Stoic teacher of the period, and Seneca doesn't acknowledge him. I think they were probably saw themselves as, although they were fellow Stoics and so they're cousins in a sense, I think they would have been aligned with different factions, politically and philosophically, within Stoicism. Certainly the Stoic opposition, like with Musonius Rufus mentored, and it was led by Thrasea, like, I think would have seen Seneca as a political opponent.
Yeah.
And then in Cassius Dio, there's this curious remark where he claims that Thrasea, the head of the Stoic opposition, said of the people who collaborated with Nero, let their names never be mentioned again, except to explain that although they compromised and collaborated with Nero, they ended up being executed anyway, the same as the people that opposed him. Yeah. So you didn't even save your own skin by sucking up to Nero. Now, we don't know for sure, but I think anyone reading that and thinking about it, the first name that comes to mind has to be Seneca. Like, Seneca would clearly have been the most obvious example. He was Nero's right-hand man. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that one of the leading Stoics from a previous generation was famed for having condemned Seneca to a damnatio memoriae, like to say, let's strike his name out from history and just not mention it again, which is something the Romans were known for doing to people that they criticised. And that might explain why Epictetus and Marcus don't mention Seneca, because certainly you'd think Epictetus could easily use Seneca as an example to illustrate a lot of the things he's saying to his students about not compromising with tyrants and how it's a slippery slope and you can't serve two masters and all of this stuff. Kind of, you could almost put in brackets after it, see Seneca for a counterexample.
There is this politics is serving many masters by definition, right? You have multiple constituencies, and so there is something, I think, a little bit in Epictetus, as much as I like him, that's closer to the sort of origin of Stoicism, the sort of Cynic tradition. Look, the first chance he gets, he leaves Rome and he lives out far away, right? And we can't fault a person who is enslaved and exiled and experiences the worst of the system for not believing in the system and participating in it. But Seneca, I go back and forth. Sometimes I'm very sympathetic. Sometimes I'm utterly disgusted. And I think in that way, he's actually someone we have to talk about because he so embodies the contradictions, the temptations, the imperfect nature of reality that we all struggle with. You know, but there's something about Epictetus that's very pure that says, don't get your hands dirty, step away from it. Virtue's the only thing that matters. And that's great as far as it works for the individual. But I think many other Stoic thinkers and philosophers before and since go, hey, you know, when you withdraw, it doesn't change anything. All it does is cede that role or place to someone else who's almost certainly less philosophical, less virtuous, less principled. Like I think Pericles said something like, your disengagement is only possible by the increased engagement from someone else.
Yeah.
And that part, I think, many of the later Roman Stoics struggle with this idea of like, well, here's what's philosophical, here's what's virtuous, here's what's pure, and then here's the real world with its imperfect problems and solutions, and the decision to be the pen and ink philosopher on this side and the philosopher politician participant on this side, as Marcus tries to be and Seneca tries to be, it's just fraught with morally vexing decisions.
Yeah, we're never going to resolve it, because it's always been a tension that runs famously, in a way, runs through the history of philosophy. And it reminds me, in the Eastern tradition, in Buddhism, you have these two major schools of Buddhism called the Hinayana and the Mahayana. And the earliest form of Buddhism has this monastic ideal that involves retreating completely from the world, a bit like a cynic philosopher.
Or an Epicurean.
And then over time people thought, well, there seems like there's something wrong with this. You know, surely the ideal should be to benefit the rest of mankind as well. And so reconciling the benefits of withdrawing from society with the kind of meaninglessness of that, in a way, unless you're contributing to the greater good or the common welfare of mankind, has always been... I think the Stoics are kind of aware of that, though. Like, you get this tension to some extent in Epictetus. It can be explained in a way... By the way, I'll just digress for a moment and say that what we're describing, these different factions, we have a source that says there were three schools of Stoicism by the Roman period, and they were represented by followers of the last three scholarchs of Stoicism. And we don't know what the difference was between them, but
what are those names for people?
They are... one of them is Diogenes of Babylon, I think. One's Antipater of Tarsus.
Yeah.
Another one's Panetius of Rhodes. And so I think the followers of Panetius are the Middle Stoics, who follow Posidonius as well, and they incorporate bits of Aristotle and Plato. Seneca and Cicero look like they're probably more aligned with that. And interestingly, they're the ones that both write in Latin, right? So maybe that the language has something to do with it as well. This is the more kind of modernized, in a way, like, version, more kind of Latinized version of Stoicism. And then there must be, one of the others must be more old school by comparison. Seneca gives us a list of his favourite philosophers at one point, and he lists Socrates and the founders of Stoicism, and he also lists Plato, but he doesn't list Diogenes the Cynic, interestingly. Whereas definitely, if you asked Epictetus, who are your top three favourite philosophers, he would say Socrates, and maybe he says Zeno and Chrysippus. He'd definitely say Diogenes the Cynic. So I think there's this more urbane version of Stoicism, where they are more into Plato and Aristotle, and Roman senators are quite into it. And then there's this more hardcore old school version,
it's like fundamentalist Stoicism.
Fundamental Stoicism. And Epictetus is clearly... Now the weird thing is that Marcus Aurelius ends up being into the more hardcore fundamentalist Cynic oriented version of Stoicism. But Yeah, definitely. That's something that I think they struggled with. So in Epictetus, I think this is something that people ask me a lot about, so maybe it's worth mentioning. He seems to be aware that we have to... There's a passage where he talks about bulls quite a lot, interestingly. And he says, how does the bull know that it can kill a lion? I didn't know that bulls could kill lions, actually, but apparently they can't. They toss them on their horns.
Yeah, I guess a water buffalo or something would have some adaptations for fighting off a lion.
They can fight off lion, if they're strong enough. They throw them up in the air on their horns and make mess them up pretty badly. So Epictetus apparently knows this, and he says, how is it possible that some bulls know, again, the calves, the heifers can't defend themselves against lions, but the strongest bull in the herd can fight off lions? How does it know that? And I think he's implying that it comes from trial and error, and the only way it can know is through testing itself and experience. And the analogy I think that the Stoics and other philosophers always have at the back of their mind is wrestling and Pancration. So he'd say, how do you know which sparring partner to pick? If it's someone that's much younger and weaker and less experienced than you, you're not going to learn anything. But if it's someone that's much bigger and stronger and more skilled than you, you're just going to get humiliated. And, you're probably not going to learn anything. He's going to beat you within a second, and it's going to be kind of demoralizing. So really you want to find somebody who's slightly better than you, and that you kind of stand a chance of potentially beating. You can learn something. You've got to kind of pick your battles, as it were. He says if there's too much smoke in your house, you should get out. But if there's a little bit of smoke, maybe you could put up with it. And I think this is a similar kind of analogy. So I think what Epictetus might say is you need to pick your career in a similar way. If you think that you have the integrity, the wisdom, the composure to get into politics and keep your cool, then maybe the gods have put you in that position. Maybe you are the right guy for the job. But most of you guys, his students, aren't up to this.
Yeah.
You're novices when it comes to Stoicism. And some of you might be better off retreating from society for a while in order to cultivate your virtue. So, choosing a career is like choosing a sparring partner.
Because it's going to challenge you and tempt you and put you in vexing moral positions, and it has the potential to bring out the best in you, but also the worst in you.
And you meet guys like that in different careers. You meet people that seem to be able to maintain their composure and their integrity, even in a business where there's a lot of corruption or a lot of temptation. And then you meet other people who wouldn't last 5 minutes, who are smart, who are educated and competent, but are easily overwhelmed,
they
by
want
the stress.
Approval too badly, or their moral compass isn't clear enough.
Yeah. So I think Epictetus is saying, look, I can't tell you. Other people can't tell you. You need to become a good student of your own psyche.
Yeah.
You need to learn to know yourself, like the bulls in the herd, and figure out, are you just like a little calf that's going to get eaten alive by the lions?
Yeah.
Are you the big alpha bull in the herd that can toss the lions on its horns and isn't scared of them?
Right. Are you meant for the scholar's life or the soldier's life?
Yeah.
Right. Are you meant to be in the arena, or are you, a spectator or a critic or what have you? You've got to know. And I think Seneca, he says, he pities the person who hasn't been in the ring, who hasn't been bloodied and bruised and knocked out, because they don't know what they're capable of. Now, we could argue that Seneca gets in the ring with more than he could handle, but also I think we have to acknowledge and respect the fact that he was so in the mix, in the room where it happened, that I don't know, and I can't imagine many people that were tested the way that he was tested, and whether you or I or they would do better in those situations. I mean, the incredible, Seneca would probably say, do you know what I prevented Nero from doing?
Yeah.
Do you know how much worse he could have been? He could probably say, if what I was really after was my own power and my own enrichment, like what you think I was compensated for is a fraction of what I could.
Yeah.
He's like, do you think if all I cared about was money or power, you think I was writing these plays or reading these books? So I think Seneca would probably see himself as having been quite heroic in all of it. Now, how much of that is what he has to tell himself to sleep at night? When you compare it to a Thrasea or an Agrippinus, some of these other Stoics who really did kind of put it all on the line, I think they stand up better. But Seneca was put in Shakespearean level dilemmas, and some cases I think he really did well, and in other cases, we hold him up as an example of what not to do.
Well, that's a good segue into a completely different perspective on the whole thing, which is when you're writing a biography about someone like Marcus Aurelius, one of the questions that I ask myself is, what can we tell about his character by looking at the content of the Meditations? Like, what's he worried about in the Meditations? And then also, there's another simple question, which the Romans, I think, ask themselves more than we do, but it's a useful question to ask, which is, what don't they mention? Like, he doesn't mention Seneca.
The dog that doesn't bark.
Yeah, who doesn't he mention? What's missing from this? Marcus says a lot about his relationships with other people. He says a lot about justice. He says a lot about anger.
Yes.
He says a lot about not being alienated. So he's really concerned with interpersonal conflict, it seems to me. He has that entire section, 11:18, where he lists 10 different strategies for coping with anger, right? So this is clearly something, and it's not surprising, like, given his position.
Do you think Marcus Aurelius had an anger problem?
Yeah. Like, I mean, we can't know for sure, but it certainly comes across that way. I'll tell you something that might shock you, actually, and I really don't say this lightly. Like, so as someone who has a background in therapy, I used to teach therapists. I'd stand and speak at conferences, and for weeks on end, I'd speak to rooms full of psychologists and therapists and life coaches. If I said to them, and I'd do this sort of thing all the time, I'd get like a whiteboard and I'd say, how many cognitive strategies can you guys think of for coping with anger? Distinct strategies, not just different versions of the same thing, right? I think an individual, I'd be impressed if they come up with like 3 or 4. I think the group collectively might come up with, if there are 20 or 30 people, they'd come up with like 5 or 6 or something. I don't think they would come up with 10, right? Marcus not only has a list of 10 distinct cognitive strategies, most of which are pretty viable in modern therapy, but he keeps returning to selections from that list throughout the book. So it's clearly not something he's just kind of copied down. He's memorized this, and he's using it repeatedly. So he has, maybe this is overstating in a way, but, to be blunt about it, he has potentially the level of knowledge and understanding of coping with anger that I would expect from a therapist. Why would you know 10? Like, even as a client, you'd normally learn like 2 or 3 self-help techniques and focus on the things that work. But you'd only know that many distinct techniques if actually you're teaching them to other people. He must have learned them from someone who is an expert on coping with anger. But his knowledge of this is surprisingly extensive. As a therapist, it seems surprisingly in-depth and extensive to me.
We have to credit Marcus, too, with the fact that he didn't need to give a shit about it at all.
Yeah.
Like, I think of the story of Hadrian. His secretary makes a mistake. He's livid.
Yeah.
He grabs a stylus off the table and he stabs it in their eye.
Yeah.
What are the consequences for this horrendous, loss of control, giving oneself up to the passions, as the Stoics say? There are none. He begs the guy for forgiveness, and the guy says, I'll do whatever you want for me. And Hadrian says this, and the man says, well, I'd like my eye back, please. Right. And so this story, perhaps Marcus witnesses it happening. Certainly that story would have followed Hadrian around. As a young, future Caesar, Marcus could take from this, I can do whatever I want. Or he can say, I never want to be that person. And there is clearly this sense that it is a self-imposed limitation, right? It is a battle he is waging on himself against something he is ashamed of or regrets or wants to rein in, not because he's forced to, but because philosophy and his heart is telling him, hey, you're going to do things you regret. It's going to hurt people. What are the ancients tell us? What's the literature? He's struggling on this quite genuinely and earnestly, because he feels that it's important, and it's kind of, you could argue, it's kind of the battle of his life.
Yeah, I think so. And he didn't exhibit anger. Like, we're told of several incidents where Herodes Atticus lunges at him during a legal hearing as if he's going to throttle him. Like, in the Praetorian prefect leaps forward and stops him, and Marcus supposedly is just completely composed and said, we'll just adjourn until tomorrow. Like, so he had this reputation for being completely unfazed. So it's an interesting example of somebody who feels that he has a flaw and really struggles to overcome it, and by the accounts of other people seems to have succeeded in doing that and appears more composed than anyone else around him. Now, actually, we said we jump around a bit. I just want to throw in another bit of historical trivia that a lot of people maybe don't notice. It's kind of in the small print, as it were, in history. Hadrian, during his political purges, goes after, at one point, Marcus's maternal grandfather, who he was very close to. Marcus acknowledges him at the beginning of the Meditations. And also, and this is a bit more like spaghetti junction of Roman families, Marcus's sister's father-in-law, right? So the father of the guy that Marcus's sister married. So I don't know if he exiles them. He accuses them of conspiracy, and then he strips them of office, Hadrian. But he'd recently just executed a senator, a consul, for something similar. So towards the end of his reign, Hadrian's going after Marcus's family, and potentially threatening to have him beheaded or whatever for conspiring against him. So I definitely think Marcus would have looked at Hadrian and thought, this guy's out of control.
Yeah.
Right? Hadrian would have been like a frightening guy to be around towards the end, because there were no consequences to his actions. He's the guy that he didn't care anymore.
Yeah.
Like, he was suicidal. He was kind of losing his mind. He was riddled with disease. His limbs were grotesquely swollen. Apparently had a horrible skin disease that it was itching terribly all of the time. It kind of reminds me almost like, you know how sometimes you're reading about these historical figures and they remind you of characters in movies and stuff. He makes me think of the Baron Harkonnen in some way in Dune, right? He's kind of become this grotesque figure. He builds this huge palace outside of Rome. He has this massive estate with many buildings in it. Marcus has to come and live in it. Like, he does. We're told he doesn't want to.
He's in the monster's den.
Yeah, like, it's surrounded by spies. Yeah. Hadrian had spies everywhere. Like, so I definitely think Marcus looked at Hadrian and was terrified and thought, I don't want to end up becoming, this guy's a monster.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't want to end up being like him. He was only like 16 or something when he had to go in and live with him for about 3 or 4 months just before he died. It's a train wreck and dangerous because he's constantly threatening to execute people around him and going a bit crazy.
He's everywhere that Marcus doesn't want to end up.
Yeah, Marcus doesn't want to end up like that. Now, I said the things that people don't mention. So Marcus is very concerned about these interpersonal conflicts, but he doesn't say very much about greed for wealth, which is a major Stoic concern. He mentions a little bit about the desire for pleasure and hedonism and stuff, but not that much. He says a lot more about anger and justice and social virtue and stuff like that.
You get the sense of Marcus as being a guy who's post-economic. Like, money is he's not a guy who carries a wallet.
No, he's
he never has to. He is basically, he wears his wealth lightly, but also he's so privileged, I think, that money, or the lack thereof, or the desire for more, it never computes for him.
It doesn't figure barely in the Meditations at all. Whereas Seneca does mention, like, overcoming gold, the desire for it, and greed for wealth. So it may be that there's a clue there that Seneca was clearly a social climber.
But also Marcus never has everything taken from him, right? So you can imagine in Seneca, first off, his family is not exactly new money, but they are successful sort of climbers in their own way. But then, if you have something like an exile, I can imagine it makes you desire to never be so vulnerable again.
Yeah, I'm not going to let that happen again. So it is like, so we have these two very different characters that come from very different backgrounds, like have very different experiences, and they embrace different versions of Stoicism. So you could say Marcus's privilege in a way allows him to embrace a more extreme Stoic ideal, perhaps. He's never had to worry about money. He's never been exiled. He just doesn't think about it. The other clue is we look closely at Marcus's biography. We're told he started studying philosophy when he was 12, which is unusually young, even in the ancient world. Not that many people would have studied philosophy. They would probably have begun when they were about 15. Most of his friends would be studying rhetoric and oratory, maybe little bits of philosophy, but they wouldn't have kind of majored in it, as it were. So even that's unusual. But we're not told much about what he read when he was 12. We're told that he dressed like a philosopher and slept on a camp bed on the floor and stuff like that. So there's two things that I would
speculate. This is like a decade before he would have even heard of Epictetus, right? Because I think he's in his 20s when Rusticus gives him Epictetus. So he has a long study of philosophy before the real light bulb goes off.
And I don't imagine when he's 12 that he's studying syllogistic logic, right?
Yeah.
So I suspect that he's picking up little bits of philosophy from reading plays and poetry and stuff like that, maybe attending a few speeches, but he's probably embracing more of the lifestyle rather than the kind of abstract technical side
of
it.
Stuff, probably.
Yeah, and modelling himself a little bit more. So it may well be, as some people have suspected, that he starts off more leaning towards the Cynic lifestyle, and he maybe views it more as a yoga, or a lifestyle thing, rather than as a technical, study of logic. Although there's a really interesting passage that's little known in Fronto, where Fronto describes one of Marcus's philosophy lectures, and he's kind of sneering at it. Like Fronto's always kind of like sneering at things, but he says, when you go and do your philosophy, he's complaining that rhetoric is a much more practical discipline than philosophy, and he's saying in your philosophy lectures you just sit yawning and staring out the window, and they don't even give you any homework, nobody pays attention, and they teach you the syllogistic logic stuff. And so he doesn't say what these lectures are, but Marcus's main philosophy teacher at that time would have been Apollonius of Chalcedon, who's a famous Stoic. So unless he's talking about something completely different, Marcus seems to be mainly studying Stoicism. It may be that the type of Stoicism that he was exposed to early on was more academic, more about logic. Epictetus clearly thinks his students are reading lots of books on Stoic logic.
Yeah.
And he thinks you guys are becoming too bookish. He's always kind of berating them about that. So I think we can imagine that Marcus might initially have resembled Epictetus' students, and being, like philosophy students today. It's a kind of abstract, bookish subject. He is literally sitting in these lecture theatres, doing logic exercises and stuff, and he maybe doesn't really think of it. He's doing cynicism or something like that early on, but he maybe doesn't really see Stoicism that much in terms of being a kind of practical lifestyle until he encounters Epictetus. We think of Stoicism in a particular way, but it's mainly because we've got Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. A lot of ancient Stoic writings were maybe more dry than the stuff that survives today. Like we have fragments from Hierocles, for example, that's more like a lecture on, the ethics and, natural philosophy and stuff like that. It may be that Epictetus was kind of unusual, and Marcus is following him and having this really kind of practical focus. Chrysippus, we kind of get the impression was, quite dry.
Epictetus' line about Chrysippus is so good. There's a student, he's bragging that he's read all the works of Chrysippus, and how long it took and how difficult it was to wade through. And Epictetus says, if Chrysippus had been a better writer, you'd have less to brag about. And I think the point, to me, the essence of Stoicism philosophy, but also just great writing, is like, it shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be complicated. It should be clear and concise and straight to the point. And that's what's so, of course, amazing about Meditations is Marcus is writing to himself. He's not even thinking about an audience at all. And yet he's so concise, so to the point, so gets to the essence. There's no fat.
Like one of the cool things is that, again, to go back to Fronto's letters, there's a really odd thing in Fronto where he says, so Fronto's got mixed feelings about philosophy, and he's competing with Marcus's philosophy teachers, particularly Rusticus, to become his main teacher. Yeah. And Rusticus eventually seems to win out. And so Marcus kind of majors in philosophy, as it were, rather than in rhetoric. But Fronto repeatedly says to Marcus, I think because, in particular, Stoic philosophy is expressed in paradoxes, they're inherently hard to understand or communicate. For something Chrysippus is probably quite baffling for a lot of people to read. And Fronto says you need rhetoric if you're going to communicate these ideas clearly and effectively. And he really hammers this point home. And he says to Marcus, what you should do is take these sayings that you like and paraphrase them repeatedly to try and hit on exactly the right word or image to communicate them clearly and powerfully. And anyone that studied philosophy or a subject like that knows it's sometimes you can read a really technical book and you kind of understand it, but can you explain it to someone else? Yeah. And then someone finds like a metaphor and you go, that's it, that captures exactly what I was trying to say. It's a whole different skill. And Marcus in the Meditations is doing the thing that Fronto tells him to do in the letters. Like, interestingly, he sets him as a rhetoric exercise, though. And sometimes people have said to me, why is the meditation still popular today? And I think it's because the philosophy is concise, it's profound, it's expressed in an artfully vague way, so that we can immediately put ourselves in Marcus's shoes. So the most famous passage in Meditations, I think, is 2.1.
Yes. By the way, I had someone in here. He's an actor, and he just has 2 lines .1, and it's just a reminder of the opening.
The opening of
essentially the opening of Meditations, because we could say Debts and Lessons is sort of the preface, but Marcus gets into it with, today the people you meet will be.
And he doesn't say them. He doesn't name any names or anything, right?
Yeah.
So we can read that and think, well, yeah, like that guy that works in my office is a bit like that. Or my mother-in-law, and we project ourselves into it because he expresses it in a kind of surprisingly vague, abstract way at times that allows us to imagine it applying even to our own lives. But I believe that Marcus was a great writer.
I think he's the greatest writer of all the Stoics.
Yeah, and people, because he's writing aphorisms, we don't get to really see good example of his speeches or letters, but he's the proof is in the pudding, right? He's written aphorisms that people get tattooed on themselves, like nearly 2,000 years later. Like, people memorize sayings from the Meditations because he's taken ideas that Chrysippus would have expressed in technical jargon
in a whole book
and articulated them with a really captivating image and really clear language. And that's a skill that Fronto has spent years, decades teaching him, and that his Greek rhetoric tutors. Marcus had extensive training in writing and rhetoric. And I think you can see, some people have questioned that and said you can't see evidence of it. I think you can totally see evidence that he's a highly skilled aphorist. Like, in the Meditations, of course you can't. Like, people love the Meditations.
I mean, the fact that he is doing it to himself in Greek, on the front lines or in the palace or at the Colosseum, we hear him, pouring over his books. The fact that he's doing it quietly, internally in some respects, and it's so good that we're talking about it 2,000 years later that you can be a genius, or you can be a prisoner picking it up from the library, an uneducated, uninformed person just picking up for the first, and you can just get it, and you get what he means, and you can apply it to your life right now, and that he's synthesized 2,000 years, hundreds of years of wisdom up until that point, and it stood the test of time. I mean, that is a feat that very few people can ever claim.
And it has psychological implications.
Yeah.
Because if you want a philosophy to impact your life, you need to, and this is something that's, I always thought it's strange that in education and in psychotherapy, there are many different ways of conceptualizing psychotherapy, but we don't usually conceptualize it in terms of memorization. And we should, because clients forget most of the things that therapists tell them, right? And when clients benefit from things in therapy, it's because it sticks in their mind, and they remember it for the rest of their life, and they remember it in the right situation at the right time, and it is evocative for them. It changes the way they see things or the way they feel about things. So memorization, what's the point in learning something if you forget it, right? So in order to remember it, it helps if you're an expert in classical rhetoric and you can find the perfect word and image to encapsulate an idea. People remember what Marcus says, and that's one of the reasons that it's therapeutic.
Yeah.
Because people read, look at all the self-help books people read. In therapy, we see clients all the time that tell us they're self-help junkies, and they have a library full of self-help books. And then you can say to them, well, what ideas did you take from that book? And they'll say, I don't know, I can't remember. I read it.
Yeah.
I read it twice, but I still don't really remember that much from it. Or I didn't put it into practice. It's a combination of forgetting it and not really, following through and putting it into practice.
We're not getting it in the first place because it wasn't clear enough.
Or it wasn't clear enough in the first place. Yeah. So Marcus is doing something not just that's beautiful, but, sometimes beautiful things have a practical value. The beauty of the meditations makes it more evocative and more memorable, and therefore more therapeutic.
Stoicism is this thing that feels very masculine, very male-centric. But the primary influence on Marcus's life, you could argue, isn't Antoninus, it's his mother. She's this sort of quiet model of Stoicism that historians and subsequent philosophers don't give enough credit to. But what does Marcus Aurelius learn from his mother?
Well, you could, at a stretch, you could view her as his first tutor. And, she's the only woman. He mentions his sister fleetingly, but other than that, his mother is the only woman that he acknowledges in Book 1 of the Meditations. I think the most revealing thing about her is that Fronto writes to Marcus at one point and says, I'm going to write a letter to your mum in Greek, right? Fronto's an expert on Latin. Marcus's mother was not just fluent in Greek. Like most educated Romans would be bilingual in Latin and Greek, but she seems to be completely fluent in it. And Fronto, who's the most acclaimed Latin rhetorician in the world, writes this kind of slightly pathetic letter to Marcus saying, could you just check it for mistakes before I send it to your mum? Because I'd be embarrassed, for her to read it and think I've got the grammar slightly wrong or something.
Right.
So, and in Roman society, to look to a woman like that as your superior intellectually is unusual. Like Fronto, and also Fronto mentions that his wife is like a student to Marcus's mother. He actually refers to her as Marcus's mother's client, meaning her kind of subordinate, like her student. So a bit of a strip, but the picture kind of emerges of a woman who is like a multimillionaire, billionaire, construction industry magnate. We have bricks with her name stamped on them that survive today, right? She owned clay fields and brick and tile factories that she inherited from her family. She never remarried after Marcus's father died. She would have been in her early 20s or late teens when her husband died. She remained single. Marcus and her went to stay with Marcus's paternal grandfather for a while, but then they leave and they go back into her house, which again shows unusual independence
Yeah.
in Roman society. And she seems to have surrounded herself with a kind of intellectual circle, a kind of salon, of which she is the centre. And so Marcus grew up in a sense, in a school, or among a circle of leading intellectuals. Herodes Atticus, who's another crazy guy, colourful figure, he's the most famous sophist of the period. He lived for a while in the same household as Marcus's mother, so he's a close family friend. He later becomes Marcus's Greek rhetoric tutor. So Marcus's mother is mingling, is maybe family friends with or grew up alongside the most famous Greek orator and sophist of the period. She seems to be familiar with Rusticus. Marcus mentions that Rusticus wrote a letter. Maybe she chose Rusticus to be Marcus's tutor. There's another really obscure clue in the Meditations that I didn't notice until I was working on this. Another biography mentions it. That Marcus, in passing, mentions a guy called Domitius, who we don't know anything about, who he said heaped praise on his... He was very generous in heaping praise on his philosophy tutor. And the tutor that he mentions is a guy called Athenodotus, who is known to be a Stoic teacher. So there's a guy who really loves Stoic teachers. And his name is the masculine version of Domitia, which is Marcus's mother's family name. So he may have been an uncle or some other relative of Marcus's mother. So there's a tiny, when you're
She's got quite a scene.
When you really dig it, there's a hint there that Marcus's mum's family already have links to Stoicism and connections with leading intellectuals. She seems more into literature.
Yeah.
She's an expert on language and rhetoric. She must be reading plays then and other literature. There's not much indication directly linking her with philosophy. Her family have a long history of being associated with the region of Italy that traditionally was colonized by Greece and speaks Greek. So Marcus grew up in this household where he would have studied Greek literature and where his mum may have been steering him towards Stoic philosophy. We're also told she lived quite an austere... She's another one of these billionaires, who supposedly lives very simply.
Yeah, what it says, my mother, her reverence for the divine, her generosity, her inability not only to do wrong, but even to conceive of doing it, and the simple way she lived, not in the least like the rich.
And she's also said to be unlike the Roman elite in another way. Fronto kind of notoriously says there's no word in Latin for philostorgia or natural affection, and he says because it's a quality, I think he says this more than once, it's a quality completely lacking among the Roman elite. But he clearly thinks that Marcus is the exception and his mum, but they're not typical Romans because they're kind of Gratianized, to some extent. So I think Fronto's kind of implying this is a quality that's more common in the Greek world.
And he's not a mama's boy, but isn't one of the stories we have of Marcus Aurelius crying that he doesn't want to have to move out of his mother's house and to the she creates such a good home, such a place of love and affection and comfort and security, the things that supposedly a Stoic is not interested in, that he doesn't want to leave.
He's definitely close to her. So in the letters with Fronto, she gets mentioned quite a lot. Yeah. And Fronto's always saying, say hi to your mom and things like that. But Marcus, even after he's married, I don't think he ever, or Faustina only gets mentioned very fleetingly. So it's interesting, you think, they always mention his mum, but they don't really mention his wife, right? And the way that Fronto talks about her is with reverence. It really comes through, not just as a powerful and wealthy Roman woman, but as his intellectual superior in some ways. So I wish we knew more about her, right? And what she says, it's just one fleeting little remark there, not to only to avoid wrongdoing in your actions, but also in your thoughts. In a way, that sets up the entire agenda for writing the Meditations. The whole
That's
concept...
the ideal that Marcus is aspiring to all his life.
Yeah, like the whole concept of writing the Meditations is about following through on this thing that he remembers his mother saying at the beginning, which is to work on his character.
Yeah.
Like to improve his mind and not just his external behavior.
And I think it's really important that we don't just, when we run down the lists of famous Stoics, it's not just the people who wrote about Stoicism. It's this whole other half of society that embodied the Stoic ideals within the confines of a society that was inherently misogynistic and patriarchal, although there were exceptions to that rule. But ultimately, it's like we focus too much on the Stoic generals and the Stoic philosophers and thinkers, and we don't forget who they were actually aspiring to be like in Marcus's case. It's like his mother is the philosophical model for what he's trying to, she's kind of naturally, effortlessly this thing that he's very deliberately and methodically having to cultivate inside of himself.
You know, one of the striking things about Stoicism, that leads on to a really interesting point, which is the Epicureans thought that they virtually worshipped Epicurus. They would have images of him that they carried around. They memorized his words verbatim. They celebrated his birthday. It's almost like a personality cult, right?
Yeah.
So Epictetus is the kind of final word in certain regards. He's their role model, the founder of their sect. The Stoics do look to Zeno as a role model, but not in anything like the same way. And they very frequently look for moral exemplars from outside their own tradition. Socrates is their favourite. He's not a Stoic.
Yeah.
He's a precursor of Stoicism. Diogenes the Cynic, he's not a Stoic. He's a precursor of Stoicism. They also like Pythagoras. They like famous figures from history that are not connected with philosophy at all. They're interested in what they can learn from fictional characters in tragedies and in mythology. So the Stoics seem to have baked into them a more generous attitude towards recognizing, and I think in a way there's a confidence there that what their philosophy teaches is true, right? So if they think, but Stoicism is right, it's arriving at these kind of perennial truths. So of course we'd expect people all over the world to have glimpsed at least some of that we should find in ancient tragedies, glimpses of similar ideas. It'd be weird if no one else had, it'd be weird if this is actually true and no one else had glimpsed any of it at all ever. Like, they assume, no, other people must have seen at least fragments of this. And so they're always looking, like famously, Seneca's first 20 letters or so go on about Epicurus and how there are bits. He's clear that he's very opposed to Epicureanism, and he's quite scathing about it in some other places. But he thinks there are bits of Epicureanism that are insightful, and he refers to their insights as the common property. He says wisdom is the common property of mankind. Like, he comes close to virtually saying it's perennial wisdom.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of archetypal. It's innate in us. And the Stoics just have done a better job of articulating it. But there are bits of it scattered around us everywhere.
I think Marcus's mother as a model of a sort of a natural Stoic is important. The other two female ones that I'd be curious for your thoughts on, and I think are worth highlighting just to counterbalance the overwhelmingly male lineage and understanding of Stoicism. We have Cato's daughter, Portia Cato, who seems in some ways more Stoic than her husband, right? Mm-hmm. He's the one who's racked with anxiety and guilt, and she's like, we got to do this. And she would have been taught philosophy from her father, Cato, flashing forward to Musonius Rufus, who basically says, of course women should be taught philosophy. Virtue knows no gender. So I think she's interesting. I'd love to hear your take on her. And then flashing forward to the end, someone that I didn't know that much about until your book and some others, which is Marcus Aurelius. Commodus is such a huge disappointment, the antithesis of Stoicism in many ways. But then one of Marcus Aurelius's daughters is executed by a later emperor and is just the absolute model of Stoic badass courage and fearlessness up until the end.
Yeah, she says something like, "I'll show you that I am a daughter of Marcus Aurelius."
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish we knew more about it. Well, that's about all that we know, really. So we tend to
So those were her final words.
Yeah.
She's forced to take her own life,
Yeah.
or her life's being taken. And what does she say?
She says, "I'll show you that I'm Marcus Aurelius' daughter," if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so clearly, of course. I mean, yeah, we tend not to think about this, but some of these other women must have been intellectuals like Marcus's mother and steeped in the literature. They weren't public figures like the men, so they didn't normally write books or give speeches in that society. So then they're kind of invisible.
Yeah.
From history. But sure, like these women read philosophy. They got bits of philosophy also from poetry and from the plays that they were writing. And I wish that we knew more about them. The other famous philosopher who has a lot of female influences, there were the Pythagoreans. We hear about quite a lot of female Pythagoreans, incidentally, but so I've just written a book about Socrates, and I try to really talk about a number of the women. Like with Socrates, we get all of these tantalizing references to women. That's starting with his mum, Finarete, whose name actually means bringing virtue to light.
Wow.
Weirdly, and which coincidentally we're told that was kind of part of her job. She was a matchmaker and a midwife.
Huh.
In Greek society. She would be like an older woman who was like a mentor to young women, and so she helped kind of improve and educate young women. She identified suitable husbands for them, and so her name Finarete, maybe it's a nickname, but it seems to reflect something about her role. And we're told about a number of women that Socrates is influenced by in quite profound way. One of them is the Pythia, who says no man is wiser than Socrates, and he blames her basically for setting him in the Apology. He says that was the beginning of my philosophical mission, when this idea was kind of put out there and planted in my head. Then in the Symposium, he says there's a woman called Diotima, who was a priestess who taught him about the philosophy of the art of love. We see him talking in the Memorabilia of Xenophon to a prostitute, a courtesan called Theodota. So there are these women surrounding Socrates that seem to quite profoundly influence him.
Yeah.
And maybe that is a kind of theme that you find recurring in history. But it's like behind every great man, there's a great woman. Like sometimes when people say, why aren't there more famous women in ancient philosophy, it's often because they're kind of just on the periphery.
Yeah.
If you want to find them, where you should look is at some of the famous men, and then kind of look beyond them at the women that are surrounding them, because it's the men that get recorded in history typically, but the women are there with them.
Weirdly, you could argue that that's what makes them the true Stoics, is in that they cared less about the credit, less about the attention. There was fundamentally more of a humility and a lack of egotism that Cato is great, but there's some part of Cato that needs to be recognized for his greatness constantly.
I'll tell you another bit of trivia. Like you could see, so in the Delphic, the Temple of Apollo, in some ways is the source of the entire philosophical tradition.
All women.
Yeah, the Pythias were all women. Their sayings had to be interpreted by male priests, but the women, there are legends surrounding them. For example, we're told by a number of sources that Pythagoras learned his ethical philosophy from one of the Pythias, one of the priestesses of Apollo. And the sayings, the maxims that come down to us, Plutarch, who was a priest at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, as well as being a philosopher, says that books many volumes long have been written trying to explain the sayings of the Pythia, which are in Greek often two words, like gnothaiseauton, like know thyself, maiden agan, nothing in excess. Like not all, but most of them are just two words, almost like a Zen koan.
Yeah.
Right, and then they'll take these two words, and then it's almost like a seed that's handed from the Temple of Apollo to philosophers, and philosophers go away, and write these lengthy books, try to figure out what know thyself means, or what does nothing in excess mean, So, but this was, women are at the center
Yeah.
of that, like in the kind of prehistory of philosophy in a way, right? A few steps before Socrates.
And I think that tradition's continuing today in the sense that, like, I think people think, the audience for my books or your books is all men. And the number of women that I hear that are interested in Stoicism, because at the end of the day, leadership is leadership, life is life. And these ideas, as Musonius Rufus was saying all those years ago, really have nothing. Society can be gendered and discriminatory and, can make these distinctions. But ultimately philosophy is about helping you be a human being in the world, and so there is nothing gendered about virtue. It just is what it is.
I've got a question for you, a personal question for you then, Ryan. Do you think it's difficult to be into something like Stoicism if your wife isn't into it? Because my wife has many opinions about Stoicism. My wife's more into Stoicism than I am, I think, sometimes.
My wife's joke is that one of us is a Stoic and the other writes about Stoicism.
Yeah.
Because I think she is closer to the model that Marcus Aurelius is talking about, where someone is sort of effortlessly those things or naturally those things. And for me, it's something I actually have to work on, and I am thinking about constantly, and I'm having to get myself to, like, this idea that women are emotional and men are not. I know so many men who are emotional, not in the sense like they cry, but just men who lose their temper easily, who are constantly comparing themselves to other people, worried about like the idea that women can't take to these ideas of mastering your emotions, enduring suffering, like childbirth being the penultimate example of, like, talk to me about someone who actually has to draw on Stoicism in moments of in a moment in their life. Like, I do think it's going to be hard to be Stoic if you're with a very unstoic person. Although the argument for Socrates is that, his difficult marriage was his ultimate philosophical training ground.
He's the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, let me ask you, though, because I think I know who my books are popular with, and I know you know who yours are popular with. And I think I have a sense of who you are. There is this, the philosophy has become more popular and reintroduced, there is this thing that the cliche way to dismiss Stoicism is they call it Bro-ism, right? This sort of modern self-help, toxic masculinity idea of Stoicism that you see, whether it's Andrew Tate or on some podcast or people on an internet message board or maybe even the YouTube comments of this. There is that, and I feel it and I dislike it. What is your take on that?
I think my perspective is a bit different because of my background in therapy, right? So let me answer that in a roundabout way. When you do evidence-based psychotherapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, you have to study medical research, and it gets really, really, really technical. Like, I mean, I'm not the best at statistics, right? I have to grit my teeth and kind of like study stats and stuff. And it's hard to read, although apparently not, because now everybody's an expert on epidemiology, like overnight, right? Of
course.
But it's hard. It's postgraduate level like stuff. But then your clients are just like random people, like it could be an elderly Jewish matriarch. It could be a 15-year-old kid that's like in trouble with the cops. It could be the guy that works at the bank down the road. It could be, it's just a sample, a random sample of society that walks in your door. And then your job as a psychotherapist, it's a little bit like public health or something. You have to take state-of-the-art technical research and translate it into language that is understandable and relevant to the elderly Jewish matriarch, to the 15-year-old kid that's in trouble at school, like to a guy that's been in prison, to the CEO of some huge company, to a successful actor, right? And so the job of a good psychotherapist is constantly to be thinking, how am I going to, a bit like Fronto tells Marcus Aurelius to do, right? How can I take this and put it find a metaphor or create a little diagram or put it in a way that's really going to impact this client, right? So I assume that all good advice that's based on psychology, whether you want to call it self-improvement, self-help, psychotherapy, whatever, has to take many different forms that target different markets.
Sure.
Right? You wouldn't take Bertrand Russell's Conquest of Happiness and give it to a 9-year-old schoolgirl.
Yeah, or a professional athlete or something.
Yeah, like, I mean, but there's certain people that book would be absolutely perfect for.
Sure.
Right? And so, you know, when people say, oh, there's versions of Stoicism that are kind of like Bro-ism, and you know they're dumbed down or they're simplified or they're aimed at people that like all the examples are people that work in the tech industry or something like that. I think, but that's a market, like that might be a client in psychotherapy, and you'd have to do psychotherapy. You'd have to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, are you saying they don't? Are you saying they don't deserve philosophy? That's effectively what you're saying, which is crazy.
They're not going to sit down maybe and read a really dry. I mean, my first degree's in philosophy, right? I love reading really boring books, right? But there are loads of technical books on Stoicism or, you know, therapeutic aspects of philosophy that are not easily readable.
Yeah.
You know, the only therapeutic value they'd have for most people is curing insomnia. Yeah. Like they just put them to sleep. So there has to be, like, if as a therapist you're constantly prescribing self-help books to clients, right? And so often you think, you know, go and read this book by this guy. I'm sure lots of therapists recommend your book to their clients, right? Because if they have someone that comes into therapy and they are into, like, you know, the kind of videos that you do and stuff, and, you know, they resemble your kind of audience, then a CBT therapist might be, go and read Obstacles of the Way by Ryan Holiday, like, because it's the sort of stuff that you're into. It's the sort of stuff that you're into is the main,
sure,
you know, you have to match up. Is it broadly consistent with what we're trying to do here? Are you actually going to enjoy reading it? Like, there's no point in me prescribing you a book if you're going to get to page 3 or 4 and then think, gee, that was so dull, like, and I'm not going to read the rest of it.
But when I think of Bro-ism, when I'm steel manning the argument against Bro-ism, the idea that here's this philosophy that tells you to stuff down your emotions. Mm-hmm. Here's this philosophy that's about your personal development,
right,
that's turning away from your obligations to other people. But there is this version of Stoicism that I think has become popular online that's like, here's the recipe for being a better sociopath, right?
Yeah.
And that I am disturbed by. And there's also a version of the Stoicism I think has become kind of seized by a kind of a movement you might call kind of a modern day know-nothingism, which there's misogyny there, there's racism there, there's sort of political callousness there, and it's this kind of like, I got mine, I don't give a shit about weak people, I don't care what other people are going through. That version of Stoicism to me is a profound perversion, especially of what Marcus Aurelius is talking about.
Well, there's good and bad versions of popular Stoicism, right? And so I think it's a mistake to go to either extreme and say all popular Stoicism is fine,
sure,
or all popular Stoicism is just awful and toxic.
Yeah.
There's a mixture, right? Like, same with anything, right? CBT, most of the, like, not all the criticisms, but many of the criticisms of Stoicism were made to a far lesser extent previously against CBT. For a long time, people said CBT is just in your head, it doesn't deal with the emotions, you know, it's overly rational, appeals more to men, yada, yada, yada. Like, Albert Ellis got hammered with those criticisms. And then it, like a lot of times when the criticisms don't have that much, it just died off slowly over time, and those voices kind of faded away. But now they kind of target Stoicism with that criticism, because there's good and bad versions. I've read books on, I mean, maybe I'm pretty easygoing about books on popular books on Stoicism, but I have read ones that I really thought were awful. There's one in particular where the guy that wrote it sounds like he says stuff that over and over and over throughout the book sounds like the kind of stuff that a school shooter would put in their manifesto.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
like, it's extreme. You know, I or to put it more kind of objectively, if I was still working in the NHS or a kind of institution like that, and a client showed me that, I'd have to red flag it,
Yeah.
like as a potential risk factor for this guy saying stuff that sounds very threatening, like, and he's clearly unstable, he's clearly paranoid, and he's talking about practicing with guns and other weapons, and thinking about killing people.
Yeah.
In a self-improvement book on Stoicism.
Yeah, Stoicism is not supposed to turn your heart to stone. It's
Yeah.
supposed to mean you're not overwhelmed by your emotions. You're not this walking open wound. But I mean, when I think of the circles of Hierocles,
Yeah.
I think about someone who's actually working quite hard to care about as many people as possible.
Yeah, the Stoic ideal, I mean, it's a little bit like we mentioned the Bodhisattva ideal in Mahayana Buddhism earlier. Like, the Stoic goal isn't to be, not care about anyone. It's the opposite. It's kindness as a virtue in Stoicism, like Buddhist compassion, in a way.
At the beginning of Meditations, Marcus Aurelius talks about one of his teachers taught him to be free of passion, but full of love. I think that's lovely.
Yeah, philostorgia, which is like family love, paternal love. It's actually, they're thinking in part of the love of Zeus for mankind, like his children, and they want to emulate Zeus. So they think, well, how could you become more, one of the themes in Stoicism, the theological aspect, is to emulate God. Like, Zeus is this perfect mind, so we should try and become as much like that as we can, despite, the limitations of us being mortal. So, how does Zeus feel about mankind? Well, we're all his children. Like, I mean, that sounds Christian, but that's how Marcus and the Stoics view Zeus. Like, that he has this kind of affection. Zeus is the god of friendship and xenia, like hospitality, in Greek culture. So this is a theme that runs through Stoicism that I think is often overlooked, like you say. And so in these, there is toxic, bad Stoicism out there. Andrew Tate did a video where he talks about Marcus Aurelius, and so they're definitely, like, some of these guys are definitely associating with capital S Stoicism.
Yeah.
But what they're talking about is lowercase Stoicism, which, is like a hot potato or whatever in the field of therapy. Because, I mean, very simply, I've said this a million times, but I guess one of the main things that I'd say from my perspective as a former psychotherapist is that there's a significant body of research that shows that lowercase Stoicism, we measure it using several tools. One is the Liverpool Stoicism scale, from different research teams around the world, that show that it's unhealthy and it has multiple problems. Let me do a very quick deep dive, right? Because I think people should need to understand some of this stuff, right? And it's not complicated. So people who view anxiety or fear or sadness is bad and that they have to repress them or suppress them or conceal them from other people tend to, number one, there's a well-known phenomenon called the rebound effect or the paradox of thought suppression. So if people try to suppress a thought or a feeling that's automatic, it usually recurs more frequently and more vividly in the future. Right? So there's a number of experiments that show that happening. Not consistently, but it happens enough times that it's a known phenomenon and a problem in psychotherapy. So trying to suppress negative feelings backfires in that way. We also know that people who judge the belief that anxiety is bad, for example, people who rate strong agreement with that statement show poorer outcomes long term in terms of their mental health. So viewing anxiety as bad, as shameful, as something you have to get rid of, seems long term to predict mental health problems. We know that when people view a feeling or a thought as bad, they'll automatically... Your brain is designed by evolution to allocate attention automatically to threats. So if you're a rabbit and there's a hawk on the horizon or something like that, you're naturally going to give it all of your attention. It's kind of capturing your attention.
Yeah.
Because it's a threat, right? If you think that your own tears are a threat, like if you think that your hands shaking is a threat, if you think that blushing is a threat, if you think that emotions or certain thoughts are a threat, your brain will allocate attention to them automatically. It'll narrow its scope of attention down.
Yeah.
It'll give attention to them highly selectively. You'll get tunnel vision for them, and that will magnify them and exacerbate the effect that they have on your behavior. In addition to those problems, like if you're focusing too much attention on coping with certain feelings rather than just accepting them and riding them out, it increases cognitive load. So for instance, somebody who has social anxiety, if they think, oh my God, having social anxiety means I'm weak, it means I'm not a real man, it means like I have to keep a poker face, I have to prevent other people from realizing that I'm scared inside because it's not manly enough or it's not tough enough or whatever. I've got to stop people from seeing it. That, in addition to actually just magnifying it, in addition to making it more likely to recur in the future, it's confusing because it means you're using a lot of your brain power now. You're trying to walk and chew gum at the same time. Right? So you try to have a conversation with somebody or give a wedding speech or something while also simultaneously worrying about and attempting to suppress and conceal your anxiety, like rubbing your tummy and patting your head or something like. We show that to clients in therapy. We do these things called socialization experiments. It's kind of a weird name, but that's what we call it. And, you know, again, like trying to teach things in a natural way. So we take stuff that loads of complicated statistical research shows and go, how am I going to teach this to this 15-year-old kid that's like playing bunking off school, playing hooky off school? And you'll say, tell me what you did yesterday, and just have a like normal conversation, and they'll say, okay, now do that again, tell me what you did the day before yesterday, right? But this time I want you to imagine what your face looks like while you're doing it, right? And I want you to be constantly paying attention to your breathing. And they'll be like, well, yesterday I had, and they go, it's kind of hard to concentrate while I'm doing all these things at the same time. And so you say, but that isn't that how you cope with social anxiety, right? You're imagining what your face is going to look like, and you're thinking about your breathing, for example, maybe trying to control it because perhaps someone's told you that's a good idea. The things that you're doing are making your anxiety worse. They're making you feel awkward. They're overloading your brain. And that's going to cause you to forget what you're trying to say and to feel awkward in social situations. The internet's awash with bad self-help advice that clashes with stuff that we know from, you know, research and psychopathology and psychotherapy. Jordan Peterson is another guy that gives what I consider to be quite bad psychological advice at times.
I think he needs some psychological advice.
Over time, I think more people... It's like this thing of the voices dying off over time. Like, I think over time, Jordan Peterson's kind of dug himself a hole where a lot of his people who were passionately defending him at first are now like, okay, his behaviour has maybe changed a bit over time. But he says things like... It's hard not to make fun of some of these guys, right? But this is what he says, like, blah, blah, blah lobsters, right? Because alpha lobsters hold their claws up in the air. This is what he writes at the beginning of 12 Rules. That's his argument, which is completely pseudoscientific and doesn't make any sense at all, right? And is, if I didn't know better, I would think he was joking when he said that. Like, that's what he says. But he recommends that people should stand up tall and look people in the eye when they're talking to them. Now, the reason he's saying that, weirdly, he doesn't mention this ever, but he's talking about something called the James Lange theory of emotion, which is a 19th century famous psychological theory that speculates that if people adopt certain physical posture and body language, it can affect how they feel emotionally. And there's some truth in that. Yeah, fake it till you make it. Like, there's some truth in that. And the problem is, often we find in psychology there are things that there's some truth in that don't. What the gold standard? This is my bias in CBT. We love randomized control trials because psychology is full of things that look like they should work but don't. Right. So the James Lange theory kind of looks like it should work. It sort of makes sense. There's some validity to it. It's not entirely true. However, it doesn't necessarily pan out like that in clinical trials when you get people to do it in practice. Why not? Because there's competing factors at play, and one of them is that if you try and stand up straight all the time and make eye contact with people, you increase self-focused attention. And we know that that's one of the main things that exacerbates social anxiety. So that's exactly the sort of thing that clients in therapy who have social anxiety disorder will tell you that they're already doing. They arrive
That's
at the
problem,
gate
not
of
the
therapy.
solution.
Yeah. Saying, we call them maladaptive coping strategies, but many maladaptive coping strategies, they're also called safety-seeking behaviors in therapy. Like, many of them are things that people have learned from self-help books. Not all of them, but many of them are. Andrew Tate's another one. You know, he'll tell people to do things to cope with their emotions, but he doesn't know anything about psychology.
He's also a rapist and a sex criminal. So, you know.
It's not, pick your role models.
Well, yeah, why are we talking about this? No, I totally get it.
But do you know why? Do you know why I'm talking about him? Is because there are loads of other guys that are giving similar advice and appeal to the same audience, right? They're the kind of watered down version of it. There are 101 Andrew Tate lights, right? And it's easier to pick him because he's already to a large extent debunked his own reputation because of the criminal.
Well, what I see is that audience exists, right? And you want to talk about the temptations of Seneca or any of these people. It's the same fundamental thing, which is those people exist, and there's something that they would like to be told, that they will compensate you for telling them. And so the what you have to decide as a writer, as a creative, as a personality is you go, am I going to pander to that audience?
It's pandering.
Or am I going to say what I think is true and what's important? Am I going to do what's right?
I'll tell you exactly why it's pandering. The first thing that you learn in psychotherapy is that people will do things that make them feel better in the short term, but may make them make them become worse in the long term. So Albert Ellis used to say there's a difference between feeling better and getting better.
Yeah.
Like, there are many strategies that make you feel better, but actually prevent you from getting better. And sometimes you might have to do something that makes you feel worse temporarily in order to actually get better. Maybe you've got to go to the dentist and get your teeth pulled out, you know, in order to get rid of one that's rotten. Maybe it's in your interest in the long term. Maybe you have to go and have surgery. Like, maybe you have to go and do physical exercise, you know, and if you haven't done it for a long time, you're going to feel awful for a few days and your body's going to ache, but it's going to be better for you in the long term, right? But so there's a natural tendency baked into all of us to be vulnerable to short-term coping strategies. Drinking alcohol will get rid of your social anxiety, but it causes social anxiety to get worse in the long term, like most drugs do, right? People smoke cannabis because they say it calms their nerves, but often people that rely on cannabis too much develop social anxiety and paranoia. Right, and other problems, right? So short-term coping strategies, the most popular coping strategy in the world is avoidance. It's the easiest thing. If you encounter something that provokes anxiety, your easiest solution is just to do a runner.
Yeah.
Right? But that doesn't help you to overcome or resolve the problem in the long term. It just makes you relieved temporarily. Many self-improvement gurus or self-improvement influencers trade in short-term avoidant coping strategies, right? So, and it's hard because if you say, well, if you're a therapist and you say, listen, people get kind of addicted to doing them because they'll say, but it makes me feel better, right? But it's making you worse. My favorite example was I asked every client I ever worked with how much coffee they drank, right? And, you know, clients with insomnia consistently drink tons of coffee.
Sure.
Right?
They're tired.
Yeah, they're tired, right? Yeah. That's what they'd say. They'd say, but I'm tired.
Yeah.
I'd be like, how many cups of coffee have you had? I've had 5 coffees so far this morning. One guy said, I just get the jug from the coffee machine and put it on my desk next to my computer, and I drink about 3 of those a day. He goes, I couldn't tell you how many actual cups that is.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, I don't know, like 30 or something, like 20, like maybe.
Yeah.
And then I have a couple of Red Bulls and yada yada. Like, so that sounds crazy, right? And if you say to those people, if I drank 20 cups of coffee a day, I think I might be able to give myself insomnia.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah, you'd be wired.
And they'll say, now that you say it like that, it sounds silly, but I still feel that I really need the coffee to do my job because I'm tired. And you say, but you wouldn't feel tired unless if you weren't drinking that much coffee, because then you'd be able to get to sleep at night. So there's a weird circularity to it. But the point is, it's really hard, even if it seems logical to them and it seems ridiculous to any observer, they won't let go, because it's like an addiction. And that's true of many forms of coping with anxiety as well. So, people might say, people who have panic attacks will try to control their breathing typically, right? And they go, look, I try and control my breathing because I'm worried that I might faint or have a heart attack or something if I don't. But what they need to do is expose themselves to the feelings until they become confident that nothing bad is going to happen. They need to prove to themselves it's safe and they're not going to faint and they're not going to have a heart attack. And the only way they could do that would be by allowing the feelings to wash over them.
Right.
And so the controlling their breathing, psychotherapists used to recommend that like 20 or 30 years ago, but now they seldom do because they think it prevents people from disconfirming the catastrophic beliefs that maintain the anxiety, to put it in technical jargon.
Sure.
Like, you have to feel anxiety and realize that nothing bad happens in order to get rid of your panic attacks, basically. So we actually induce anxiety and panicky feelings now in the treatment. And actually, a bit of trivia for you. Sometimes people think there's not much progress in psychotherapy, but there is. And the psychoanalysts and other early psychotherapists thought that panic attacks might be biological. They thought they were untreatable. Like, having Freudian psychoanalysis does nothing for panic attacks, right? And most other psychotherapies really struggled with them. But in the mid-1980s, two CBT researchers independently figured out, one in the States and one in the UK, figured out a protocol, a modified protocol that has about a 90% success rate in treating panic attacks. And that's now what we call the treatment of choice, like the main evidence-based treatment. So the point about that is that if you went back in time and asked psychotherapists or self-help books that were based on that type of psychotherapy, you'd get bad advice.
Right.
And we suddenly figured out they were doing it all wrong. And there was a solution like that would solve the problem. And it was the opposite in some ways of what they were previously telling people to do. But one of the risks with self-help or Bro-ism is that, like, self-improvement advice there's definitely a place for from people approaching it from different perspectives. But in some cases, the risk is that what you'll get are these maladaptive
or antiquated or generalizations. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Not based on what research actually tells us about how emotions work. I'll give you another simple example. So in that video where Andrew Tate is talking, he says something that all the Andrew Tate lights say. He says, look, if you've got anger, what you should do is go to the gym and get it out of your system. So this is what we call the venting theory or cathartic theory.
Whatever,
right? So the names for it. Right? The research studies that show that doesn't work, right? And in some cases, it can actually make anger worse. So people used to hit pillows in parking lots with baseball bats and things like that, right? To kind of vent anger. Psychotherapists got them to do that, right? Like, get it out your system, kind of, or channel it into something constructive, But if anger is cognitive, if you're angry because you believe that somebody has gravely injured you by turning you down for a date or something like that, going to the gym and pumping things or whatever, is not going to do anything to change the underlying beliefs that made you vulnerable to anger in the first place. And I'll make one other comment about this, right, that maybe is kind of challenging. But it happens to be what the Stoics say as well, right? Anger is itself resembles, in my view, a coping strategy. So anger, I view to a large extent as, it's a little bit more complex than this, but to a large extent, anger is something that we do often in response to fear. So when people feel threatened or injured, they often attempt to compensate for that by becoming angry. Right. I get angry with you because I think you hurt me. Yeah. Or I think you might hurt me, or I think you hurt something else that I care about. But that's predicated on the belief that I'm injured. So for instance, the example that these guys...
you can harm me, like the Stoics would say, if it doesn't harm your character, it can't harm you. Obviously, they're not talking about physical pain, but they're saying that, it's our understanding, our perception that you have the ability to truly injure me outside my physical form, that you can humiliate me as though I don't have a choice.
Level. Yeah. And like a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, I guess it's not just Bro-ism, but a certain type of it, the manosphere stuff, is predicated on the assumption that these guys are incredibly vulnerable, that they're easily, profoundly hurt and humiliated. And the odd thing about it is, like, from Socrates on, through the Stoics and in cognitive therapy, the first thing we normally do is, if somebody says, I asked a girl on a date and she rejected me and I felt, really devastated by that. Like, Socrates would have said, and he addresses very similar issues with his friends. He would have said, does everyone feel the same way?
Right.
Do you have a buddy that got turned down for a date and it was like water off a duck's back to him? Like, have you got an uncle or a friend, or do you know of anybody who's kind of like a little bit like crestfallen, but then just picks himself back up the next day, doesn't really like let it get to him? In that case, why do you view it as innately humiliating? Doesn't that tell you that it's something about your attitude, values, or beliefs
or this
that's making you
moment?
vulnerable?
How do you think you're going to think about it in a year or 5 years or 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Is it just the recency of it that's making it loom so large for you?
Yeah, and would someone else who interprets it differently or thinks about it differently, be far less injured by it? And I think the problem with some of the self-improvement stuff that's in the mainly tends to be in the manosphere is it makes that problem worse.
Yeah.
Like, it actually encourages people to take rejection more personally, right, and to overlook the role.
Yeah, it makes it this systemic thing, like it's women's problem or it's society's problem or it's this grave injustice as opposed to this thing that doesn't matter at all.
If you want to know how we're breeding a generation of weak-minded, vulnerable, snowflake individuals,
read that.
Read Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson. They're the ones doing it. Yeah.
And they tend, ironically, if you follow them on social media, to be constantly offended, always getting into squabbles and fights, having enormous egos. You could tell, they're the real snowflakes.
They're the most thin-skinned people that you'll ever encounter.
It's hilarious.
Also, the other thing you could do is look at the comments on their YouTube videos and ask yourself the simple question: are the people that are watching these videos and following their advice becoming less angry or more angry as a result of consuming this self-improvement content?
Or when I can tell when I get an email from one of their fans, because it's poorly written, it's nonsensical, it's usually angry, usually has a bunch of nonsense about vaccines or, the Trump or whatever. Like, I can just tell who it is. And if I saw that person in real life, I wouldn't care about their opinion. And so I don't care about it when it comes in over email.
You find that in general with people, it's not even just the individuals that are into that, but there's certain people you can tell from the very way they begin a conversation immediately, like, that they're not being reasonable. And it's like, it's often the case as a teacher or a lecturer, there's certain people that ask a question, and as soon as they've asked a question, that they're not listening to the answer. Like, they're
performing or they're trying to attack you. Or whatever.
They had no intention of listening to whatever the answer was going to be. But this is, this is a problem. It is actually quite a serious problem. Yeah. I'll tell you another bit of trivia about this that no one ever mentions. Like, the things that Andrew Tate, and to some extent Jordan Peterson, and more often the kind of Andrew Tate lights or whatever, say, are weirdly similar to things that the sophists used to say. And that, like, I think a lot of people don't realize that the sophists used to bang on. According to Plato, anyway, in the Republic, he has Thrasymachus, and also Callicles in the Gorgias go on about how the people that he's arguing with and trying to kind of persuade aren't manly. Yeah. They accuse Socrates of not being manly enough. Like, so they're saying, real men, weirdly they compare to political tyrants. Right? So they say a real man, like an alpha male, would be somebody who's above the law, who doesn't care about what the majority of people say is just or unjust. Like, they create their own laws. Yeah. Like, Nietzsche also famously sounds very similar, like, to the sophists in Plato.
Yeah, there's always been demagogues and assholes and psychopaths and sophists, as you said, who play to the lowest common denominator, tell people what they want to hear, confirm the worst instincts in people, tell them not to be ashamed of the things they should be ashamed of, And look, that's going to play to a certain audience, and ultimately you got to decide, one, whether you want to be in that crowd or not, like as you want to be the audience for that or not, or as a creator you got to decide, is that the game you want to play? And it's a game that, as Marcus says, it dyes you purple, it Caesarifies you, it changes you.
It's pandering.
Exactly,
as you
it's
said.
not good for the soul.
Plato's Socrates calls it pandering.
Yeah.
He said, he was very clear about that. Everyone knows. You could go out tomorrow, and write a book that appeals to everyone's fears and prejudices, right, and just confirms them. And you could be easy to write a bestseller that way, right? You could definitely, there are guys out there who'll put social media content out, and they'll go, I'm going to say something contrarian and controversial. It's going to get a lot of attention. So then, if all they want is likes and reach and to monetize it and stuff, it's just a mechanism. They think, we'll do more of that, like more red meat or whatever. But that's what the sophists did. They would say stuff, and if they got a big round of applause, and the audience were really psyched by it, they think, I'm going to say more of that.
Yeah.
And Socrates said, the problem with you guys is you're just saying what gets the biggest round of applause. You're pandering to the audience, right? So you're going to play to their fears and their prejudices every time. You're not even interested in whether this stuff is true or false. He compares them to confectioners of the mind in The Gorgias, famously. He says, look, one of the things he highlights is, he says, teaching self-improvement or philosophy, Socrates says, is a bit, I'd compare it to being a doctor or a nutritionist. If you care about someone's health, mental health or physical health, you'd study anatomy and physiology and medicine, and then you'd carefully prescribe food to them that is going to benefit them. You guys have never studied anything about mental health or the welfare of society, because you don't actually care whether the stuff that you're teaching people benefits them or not. And it's interesting, he highlights the fact that you never even claim to have attempted to study what is healthy for people. What you teach them is what evokes the strongest approval from them. So like a confectioner doesn't study whether the sweets that they're making are healthy or not. They don't study anatomy and physiology. They just make stuff and give it to people. Does it taste nice? Yes. How many do you want to buy? Okay, it's all based on approval rather than studying whether or not it's beneficial. And Socrates says philosophy is based on a study of what's actually good for us.
And true.
And whereas rhetoric is just based on feedback and approval. Well, social media clearly is the same mechanism. So that you'll get the social the self-improvement advice on social media that you deserve in a way. What you'll get is this kind of echo chamber of avoidance, subtle avoidance. And the point I'd make about avoidance strategies is that we tend to refer to subtle avoidance behavior. So avoidance takes a myriad of different forms. Going to the gym and venting your anger could be a way of avoiding facing up to and experiencing a fear, right? So there's lots of different drinking alcohol, watching TV, playing computer games are all potentially way. In therapy, we assess this with clients, and we interview them in depth, and we try and figure out what are the ways that this individual is using to try and avoid processing or experiencing the feelings that they find painful. And then we usually, the first thing we do is get people to drop their avoidance and drop their coping behaviors. And that often means stopping doing stuff that they've learned online from books and in workshops, so that they can process. Funnily enough, so they can process their emotions naturally. Because often, if you allow yourself to process emotion naturally, it gets resolved. The most famous example would be anxiety. Anxiety abates naturally after repeated prolonged exposure. That has to happen. If you were a squirrel and you went to the best place to get nuts and a tree fell down and it scared the living bejesus out of you, right? So you're going to run away, right? Next day you come back to the best place to get nuts, you're going to feel anxious.
Right. But the tree's not going to fall on you again.
Yeah. So, and if you keep going back, gradually your anxiety will lessen. And eventually you've got the nuts again, right? But if anxiety didn't wear off, you'd never get the nuts again. Right? And you'd die, you'd be a dead squirrel, right? Let's say. So it's obvious that anxiety has to wear off. through repeated exposure. Otherwise, animals wouldn't be able to adapt to their environment when there's no real threat there, right? And that happens. It's one of the most reliable findings in the entire field of psychotherapy research. It's the basis of one of the most effective treatments that we call exposure therapy, and it's the main technique used in behavior therapy. And yet, most people don't even realize that. They don't understand. Kids don't get taught in school how anxiety abates. You could draw a diagram of it. I used to show clients a diagram that was from a research book of a heart rate of a woman that had a cat phobia. So if I ask a phobic, if you take someone that's got a cat phobia and you put them in a room with a bunch of cats, what happens to the heart rate? Heart rate's a pretty robust measure of anxiety. Not like 100% reliable. It's like 95% reliable. It's a pretty good measure and easy. It's going to go up. How much? It'll probably double, right? Almost as if you're like running full pelt, right? Then what happens? And most phobics look confused when you ask them that question because they don't tend to want to think about what would happen if you remain. First of all, there's going to be a really powerful urge to get out of the room, and most people are going to naturally try to, for various reasons. You're conditioned to avoid anxiety. You feel relief, and that relief acts as a reinforcer of the behavior. So we very powerfully, at a very animalistic, deep level, avoidance behavior is rewarded and strengthened.
Yeah.
But if you don't, and you stay in the room, and the main reason why someone would ride it out is usually social. Normally, it's because there's someone else with them, like a parent or a teacher or a therapist or a coach, encouraging them to remain in the room and not. Left to their own devices, sadly, most people individually would need enormous self-discipline to do that. And it usually, most of the time, 95% of the time, if someone faces a fear, it's because there's someone else with them, encouraging them to do it. And usually it's your kids, are anxious about something, and as a parent, you encourage them to face a fear. And the therapist, it's often said, becomes a kind of substitute for a parental figure. So what happens to your anxiety, right? Most people look confused. Obviously, your heart rate's going to go down. How long does that take? Can vary. It could take 5 minutes. It might take half an hour. But as a ballpark, that's roughly what we're talking about. What happens if the next day, you go into the room full of cats, the same cat phobic? Well, their anxiety, their heart rate will go up, but probably won't go quite as high as before, and it will reduce more quickly. Maybe yesterday it took 20 minutes. Today it goes down to its normal resting level within 15 minutes. And then on day 3, if you do it, their anxiety will go up, but not as high, and it'll reduce more quickly, until eventually by day 4 or 5, it'll be negligible, and they'll have extinguished the anxiety. Now, anxiety, of its own accord, doesn't, to some extent, it can come back, but it doesn't usually. Usually when you extinguish anxiety, it stays gone, unless there's a complicating factor, like you're worrying verbally or intellectually about something. And that is one of the simplest phenomena in psychotherapy, and it's the basis of most of the anxiety treatments that we use. But you could explain that to a school child in 5 minutes and show them some diagrams and stuff like that. It's in Aesop's Fables.
Yeah.
He talks about a lion and a fox, and he says first the fox is scared of the lion, then the next day it goes back and its anxiety's lower, then finally it's able to walk up to the lion and talk to it, and the lion turns out to be friendly or whatever, luckily. But in the ancient world, they understood this basic principle. We call it emotional habituation, is the technical term for it. But most people don't realize that, and so they don't understand that if they just accept their anxiety and ride it out, their brain will kind of digest it, to use a different metaphor, and then they'll get stronger as a result. But if you're constantly getting angry and attacking other people as a way to mask your anxiety, if you go to the gym and channel your anxiety, if you take drugs or alcohol, or you watch computer games or movies to try and avoid contact with your anxiety, you prevent that natural habituation from being able to happen.
Right.
There are many things that can get in the way of it. And so, unfortunately, a lot of self-improvement advice just prevents that natural process from happening. We're our own worst enemy in that regard. So, but these guys, seldom mention. Sometimes Jordan Peterson does mention exposure therapy sometimes, but then he says other things that seem to kind of clash with it. Often the advice that therapists have given in the past is leading people all around the garden path. That sometimes a problem isn't even that people get bad advice. It's just that they don't get the right advice.
Right.
So you get a kind of bum steer. You're sent off in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And there are many, many people, most people that read self-help books have got some problem with anxiety. So how come hardly any of them are told the most robust thing that we know about overcoming it? They're confused and sent off in every other direction. And it might be that they get tidy your room is not bad advice, but it's not good advice either. It doesn't tell you how to actually fix your emotional problems. It might help some people, but then other people it's not going to help. It might help you temporarily. Is it going to do anything to change the attitudes that make you angry if somebody turns you down for a date? Is it going to help you to expose yourself to social situations repeatedly and for prolonged periods until your anxiety abates permanently? It's not going to actually fix the problem. So it's a distraction from the things that we know actually works. So we have to be wary of stuff that seems like good advice, but is lacking, the truth, the advice that we know is good.